Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Prove and Improve, How to Measure and Demonstrate the ROI of Your Training Programs. My name is Melissa and I will be kicking things off for us today. Let's start with some brief introductions. Our presenters today are David Wentworth, Principal Learning Analyst here at Brandon Hall Group, and Asha Pandey, Founder and Chief Learning Strategist of EI Design. I would like to extend a thank you to EI Design for sponsoring today's webinar. EI Design is a leading learning and performance support solution provider that thrives on transforming learning, keeping it relevant, impactful, and continuous. As a learning experience design company, they partner with customers in their digital transformation journey and help them future-proof their training. EI Design is ranked #1 in the list of top content providers to help you prove training ROI by e-learning industry. This is a testament of their expertise in ensuring training investments create a demonstrable impact on both the learners and the business. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we are a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. A quick mention that we currently have several certification programs open for enrollment, including our Certified Learning Strategist program. You can visit certification.brandonhall.com for more information. Your participation in our surveys is one of the most crucial components of our research. So if you have a few minutes to spare and see any topics on this list that you'd like to take a survey for, it's greatly appreciated. Links will be available in your handout, and you can always visit our main website, brandonhall.com, for the latest list. All participants do receive a piece of complimentary research once the results have been analyzed. And last but not least, a few logistics. Today's presentation is being recorded. The recording and the slides will be provided to everyone within 24 hours of the webinar in a follow-up email. If you would like to ask a question, please do so by typing it into the question box for our presenters. And lastly, if you would like to download a copy of today's presentation instantly, you may find it in the handout section also on your control panel. And without any further delay, let's dive right in.
Thank you so much, Melissa. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to my session today. Now, year on year, organizations make tremendous amount of investments in terms of time, effort, and of course, money to create and deliver trainings. Stands for good reason that this question that how did this investment eventually pan out? What was the return that the organization got is very, very important and significant. Yet L&D teams across the world find it incredibly challenging to be able to successfully demonstrate the impact and the value of the trainings. And this is the focus of our session today. During the course of next 1 hour, not only would you have food for thought, you would have great set of tips, best practices, and practical examples that you can take away from the session. We begin the exercise by first looking at the intrinsic challenges that are involved in this process. But I also touch upon good reasons why this now needs to be an exercise that's a must-have rather than just possibly need to have. Now, before you embark on this journey, there is a very significant phase that must precede it. And this is the component that we're going to be walking you through in the section 2. This entails planning, which has a combination of aspects that you need to probably reorient, sometimes redefine, sometimes reimagine. And I'll walk you through the toolkit that we use to help our customers in this endeavor. The section 3 begins with a quick listing of some of the popular models that are out there. But what I'm going to be doing is that I wanted to show you practically how these models can be applied in your organization to meet the mandate successfully. So I'm going to walk you through the methodology that we use and give you a step-by-step view of how this mandate can be successfully accomplished. I then wrap it up with a case study so that you get, again, a clearer sense of when you apply a model or a framework like that I would be showcasing, what is the gain that you're really going to see? And how does that translate to the demonstrable value that we are talking about? The section 4 touches at a very, very high level on some of the best practices that are going to help you convert the data and insights into actionable steps. Before we wrap up the discussion, I'm going to also share another handout, which is the ebook on the same topic, which has a lot more insights than what I'm going to be able to cover in the next 1 hour today. As always, I love to start each section with a polling question. Do give me your insights to the question that we're going to be raising. It helps me fine-tune the focus of the given section. So David, if you can start with the first polling question.
Certainly.
And understand what are the challenges.
Yep, we're just trying to understand. You can pick one or all or any of these, but because we know that obviously there's usually multiple challenges within any organization. But what would you say are the challenges you've faced in your organization when measuring training's impact? And so it could be the challenge with linking training to the performance and business outcomes. It could be that you don't necessarily have a strong framework or methodology in place. Maybe there's a challenge with the tools and the technology that you're using to collect the data. And we also have seen that the organizations sometimes just don't have that in-house capacity, the skill set, and the headcount to take care of this within the L&D team. So make your selections. We've got a pretty good representation here. And Asha, I just want to make sure you're still there from an audio perspective. And I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. And I'm going to share the results, and we can see that all of the options were selected by at least some of the group. The biggest thing being in making that link between training and performance and business outcomes is the biggest one. 77% of the group picked that. It goes actually in order of the choices. From there, it gets the framework and then the tools. So Asha, are you seeing these poll numbers here?
Yeah. Absolutely. So let's move forward. It's incredible what I'm going to be pulling up as the inputs that we've seen in practice. So I'm going to just very quickly walk through the 5 top challenges that we've seen in our interactions. And boy, it is spot on to what our audience today is talking about. So on top, we always see this inability to link. Then the question of the right framework. And often we hear from the L&D teams is that something which worked in a given context doesn't necessarily adapt or is scalable for others. So it's a combination of how do you start and how do you sustain usage of the same thing. And then, yes, the data collection, because the tracking is going to be the crucial element in helping us demonstrate, right? So this is the next thing that we talk about. Very often, and this is this related aspect, is when you've got this bunch of cues through various channels, how do you convert that into actionable insights? And this is the precise aspect that we're going to be addressing in the section 4. And absolutely the capability or sometimes the capacity issue that can incredibly challenge the L&D team's mandate in successfully handling this. And let's take a look at what you got to say on this, David.
Yeah, and I think people might, given the results of our poll, our informal poll here, hopefully people on the call will feel a little bit validated in that when we did this, asked a similar question in one of our larger studies, we see a lot of the same issues. The biggest one is just not actually having the metrics in front, right? Not being able to understand what it is that we should be measuring in order to do this. And this is the question was framed, what are the challenges in measuring learning's effectiveness and impact? Not measuring smile sheets and completions, but actual effectiveness and impact. And this is the places where people are challenged. And so it aligns pretty well with, I think, what everyone else is seeing with technology challenges. But I think the standout for me here is that it's only 9%, a small group said that the reason why they're not doing it is they don't see a need to do it. So the vast majority of organizations recognize there is a need to get this done, to be able to measure learning's effectiveness and impact. They're just challenged by all of these different variables.
Yeah, so given these challenges, what exactly that we are able to do and what we are not. So let's see what happens. So the classic training needs analysis phase is going to be ticking the learning outcomes to meet the specific goal that the training needs to address. And this tends to get measured through, David, just what you just mentioned, the smileys or the essential completion rates and so on and so forth. But what doesn't get addressed is the higher level goals, the change in thinking or behavior. And just because it's considered to be rather difficult, may not even get attempted. The other bit is that if you want to be able to measure something and you don't identify this upfront alongside the needs analysis phase, there's no way that you're going to be able to get the necessary data to support whether it got impacted or otherwise. So these are some of the things that happen typically in the organizations that we've been working with. So as a result, either the measurement is not getting attempted, or it is taking so much of time that by the time the insights come in, it's really too late for business to be able to apply them. So this exercise definitely is moving from a need to have or sort of good to have to now a must have. And there are very good reasons. And as we saw when we polled all of you just now, is that it's a great way to help you validate the alignment of the training to the support that the businesses seek. And if you measure something, you can also then improve, right? So that's really the second important part of the exercise. And the third bit, I think, is becoming very significant. David, this is a conversation we have often with our customers, is the fact to justify further investment. People want to see what happened in the past, right? So this is becoming a very important factor. And something which is very close to this is that once you have a pulse of what is working, what is not working, you can then allocate the budgets more rationally. I think last but not the least, I think it's a great way to leverage these results and showcase the L&D team's contribution and the value that they bring in. Now, related to this, I think there are a few important takeaways, and they are going to help us build up to the planning stage that we're going to be touching in the subsequent section. So the start of the exercise requires a far more longer collaboration between the as well as business team. And we need to remember the certification that we talking more about that we're going to do, and of course talking a lot more three kinds of metrics necessary for us to help us measure the progress and the that are necessary. And this is going to be very wide discussion very early on in the cycle. And in section 3, when I actually take you through the methodology, we'll spend a little more time on this aspect. So in the initial training needs analysis phase, we're going to be talking about a separate element of the learner need analysis. And this phase is the help us ascertain the parameters through which we're going to be assessing the impact on the learner's performance. And of course, we will use the core of the training needs analysis to identify that which KPIs would the business like to see, and as the important litmus check in this whole exercise. Now, this requires a very significant correction. And what does that entail? We use the terminology on the metrics, which is used fairly often universally. We use the terminology L&D metrics. You may be calling it as employee training metrics or something similar. And this typically would have components of the number of hours of learning planned and deployed, to the number of registrations versus the completion rates, the essential learner reaction or feedback, and yes, the assessment scores, which are at the end of the program. So now remember this metrics, and I'll be using this terminology again and again. So when I'm referring to the L&D metrics, we're talking about the basic metrics, which you definitely already have in place. But what's really missing? There are two important missing links. One, the learner performance gain metrics. Now, what is the anticipated gain, the change in whether it is in behavior, or is there something very tangible that should be reflected as the output of that skill gain? What exactly are we going to be measuring? And alongside, once this training is successfully completed by the learner, where the desired proficiency gain has happened, what happens next? So this is the bit which is the business metrics. And as I mentioned in the section 3, when I actually walk you through the methodology, I'll pick up an example where we'll see the picture if you viewed it purely from the L&D metrics perspective versus when you integrate these other two evaluation pieces, how the picture changes very dramatically. Would you like to add anything here, David?
Yeah, I think we're going to sort of reiterate and reframe this outlook on what kinds of things companies can and should be measuring. So in our research, we often separate out respondents in the surveys by their organizational performance. So we have companies that say that their things like market share and customer satisfaction and revenue and profitability are all strongly positive over the course of a fiscal year. And we call those the high performing organizations. And then we compared that group with everyone else to see if there's anything that they're doing differently, any ways that they're thinking differently. And in this particular case, we asked about the types of metrics that are used regularly or consistently to measure their learning programs. And you can see there's a bit of parity here when you think of things like completion rates or compliance requirements, those sorts of things, or even learning hours delivered, which we expect those things to be tracked and measured. But when you look at other types of outcomes, like employee engagement, right, which is more of an organizational outcome, not learner engagement, but overall employee engagement, or achieving business outcomes. You can see the massive gaps between these high-performing organizations and everyone else. So there's clearly a correlation between these organizations that are successful in their industry and in their markets and the way they approach learning measurement. They're much more likely to be focused on these outcomes, this different view of what learning is really doing with the business beyond simply delivery.
Another thing that jumped at me from this was this coaching and mentoring outcomes. And this is something that we've seen, again, as a very, very important aspect. And this is a crucial missing link, which actually helps that help us meet the essential learning outcome, right? So that's another thing, and we'll touch upon this in the subsequent section. So we're ready to have our next poll.
Go ahead and launch this one. So, we talked a bit about the challenges, and so we want to find out, how the challenges with measuring the impact affected any of these following aspects. So you can pick any or all of these, but just going now that we've seen all the different challenges with measuring the impact of training. So what are sort of the outcomes of that inability to properly measure? You're having trouble validating that the programs support the business, that you have that alignment. There could be challenges about, taking that kind of measurement and using it to improve existing programs moving forward. Is that something that you're seeing? It can also be very difficult to justify the spend for learning if you're not able to measure and demonstrate that impact. And then, of course, along those same lines, being able to showcase L&D's contribution to the organization and its value to the business. So just get a sense of what's happening because of these challenges with measurement, because that's not the end of it, right? It isn't just that we're challenged by doing this measurement, that has implications as well. So we just want to get a sense from the group what some of those implications may be. And I think we've got a pretty good representation from the group. So I'm going to go ahead and close this and then share the results. And now we're all looking, and they almost all got picked similarly across the whole way here. So yeah, and that's really what I think, Asha, you were trying to drive home with this poll, is that the ramifications of these measurement challenges are far-reaching.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the shift that we've started seeing with the customers that we're working with, is that it's no more a good to have, right? You need to, this needs to be an intrinsic part of the L&D strategy, right? So I think I'm so glad it just reaffirms what we've been seeing elsewhere. So now we come to the second section, which is the crucial precursor to the exercise that you undertake. So let's see, how do we move forward with that? I think I'm having that same problem that we had last time. It's not giving me the control to move forward. Just give me a second. Somehow after the polling question closes, I have that problem.
Let's see.
It's not giving me the control to move forward.
Yeah.
Let me just try.
I'm going to take the controls and then hand it right back to you and see what happens.
Yeah.
I'm going to give it right back.
Yeah, I do that. I got it now. This was the problem. Remember, David, we were having the last webinar as well. Yeah.
And there we are. You're there.
Yeah. All right. So the part one of this exercise is what we call as a reorientation. And what does this entail? I'm going to share the toolkit that we use at AI Design, and it has these 4 facets which serve as sort of a checklist at these 4 stages. And try to look at this as some of the basic foundational aspects that must be in place before we look at the actual mandate of training evaluation. All right. So we start with the first bit, which says that relook at the definition of the learning. I know it sounds far-fetched, but very, very vital. A lot of times the learning is equated only to learning acquisition, but that isn't going to help us see the impact that it has either on the learner or the business. So it needs to entail from acquisition to deliberate practice to application before all of that would follow. And this is the point that I was mentioning from the stats that David just shared, is also that sometimes training is not the only intervention. So coaching and mentoring play a very critical role in providing the support feedback so that that eventual successful application of learning happens on the job. The second bit, which again I briefly mentioned in terms of the learner need analysis versus the training need analysis. When I actually walk you through the framework, we'll spend a little bit more time on this. But the point being is that the modern learners' asks, expectations, and needs have changed fairly dramatically over the last 2.5 years. And this view needs to be the more dominant view with which before we decide what kind of learning strategy, what kind of a training delivery format would work. And it needs to absolutely sync up with what the learners want for us to have that significant connect and engagement. The other bit is the metrics identification. And again, I've already highlighted that this too needs to happen upfront. Now, within the schema of the various metrics that we're going to be choosing, there are some guidelines that we need to have, that it is highly objective, can be measured. We have the framework to pull in the data through which we would be able to measure this as well. And then the success of mandates like this require some additional support systems to be in place. Some of the things are which encourage continuous learning in the flow of work, learnings which happen not merely through the formal training, but through multiple channels. We're talking about social learning, we're talking of self-directed learning, we're talking about an ecosystem which can really facilitate this. So the second part of the exercise that we do at this juncture is that we look at what the organization is currently doing already. And do we have all the elements, all the enablers in place? And typically at this juncture, we look at the ecosystem. What I've shown you is what we use at EI Design. And then what measures for collecting the data are already in place. And remember, as I walk you through, there would be many more channels that we would have to open to be able to get this view. But it's also important to assess what all is already in place, and we would be able to then build up from here. Now, let's take a very, very quick one on the question before we get down to the actual framework.
Yep, let's take a look here, and we're just curious to know how successful you've been in these different approaches to measuring the impact and the ROI of your training programs. And so this was just pick whichever one aligns most with where you think your organization has been with your efforts to make these kinds of measurements. So perhaps you haven't even attempted this yet, trying to figure this all out and develop a strategy, or it's just too complex and challenging to really make any headway. Or perhaps you're able already to measure and demonstrate training impact, and you're just trying to get better at it and find new ways to look at it and apply it. Just trying to get a sense of where folks are. I think, Asha, we probably have somewhat of a self-selected group here. People wanted to tune in to learn about this, so we probably won't have a whole lot of folks in that last category. But it's always interesting to find out, and if we do, we always love if you want to share some of your thoughts and practices in that question box as well. But I'll go ahead and close this poll, and let's take a look at the results. Yeah, and as I thought, not as many saying that they're currently measuring and demonstrating training's impact, but we have a pretty even split across the rest of, haven't really been able to get started yet, or those that are making some headway.
Absolutely. So this always concerns me because, how detailed should I go in the next section, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that means I think the content should absolutely resonate. So as I said, we'll not spend time today on which model should you choose. This is the list of the popular models which are out there. But my focus in this section is really to show you how you can leverage the model. And the one which I'm going to be walking you through gives us that flexibility to A, customize, B, it also gives us tremendous scalability as we look around. So David, your insights on
Well,
which
yeah.
is the right one or the more popular one? I don't know.
Yeah, well, exactly. This doesn't say necessarily that anything is the right one or not. I think most folks on the call are probably pretty familiar with that Kirkpatrick model. There's also the Phillips level that can be added to it, which is the ROI that we're sort of talking about here. But that's Phillips level is purely, truly financially, monetary ROI, whereas Kirkpatrick's level 4 is that business impact that we're talking about as well. But you can see from our survey results, that's clearly the most popular. But there are a lot of other different types of frameworks out there, and I think as you're about to speak to, this isn't a zero-sum game here. You don't pick one at the expense of the others. It's really about trying to figure out what measurement model is going to make the most sense, or a combination of measurement models is going to make the most sense for the type of learning you're doing and the type of outcomes you're trying to measure.
Absolutely. And what jumped at me when I saw this was the second piece, which is that 44% had an internally developed model, which meant that it has used combination of cues from more than one models, right? Which I think is the right answer, right? So I'm going to walk you through the framework that we use. Litmus, as the name itself suggests, is to test whether the initial assumptions translate to the gain that we had expected, right? And at the core of it, we have used elements, most of them from the Kirkpatrick model. And essentially, we then build up the schema from the learner reaction to learning recall, retention, and then the application. And then we have elements to determine the training effectiveness. So we, in the past, focusing on the ROI, the monetization bit, but increasingly we are now leaning towards the return on expectation. And in a bit, I'm going to be touching why I believe that the ROE approach is a far, far better approach to take things forward. So this is the pictorial view of the framework. And I'll just walk you through an instance of when we put it into action, what does it look like? And then we'll run through each of these steps. And as I had mentioned, I'll also then pick up a case study to show you the difference that a framework like this can bring in, and how does it then translate to the gain impact measurement for the learner as well as for the business as well, right? So when we put into action, this is the kind of a blueprint that we create, that the reaction, what would be the enablers, what is it that we intend to do in this stage, and then we build it up for the stages as we move forward. And as you see, the intervention types which are part of these strategies could be many modes that are required. And you would see formal, informal, going all the way to social, self-directed, and all of these pieces. So let me just take a step at a time, and let's see how this builds up, and then take a look at the case study, which gives you a clear pulse for what is necessary, right? Now, we all know the training needs analysis has the learner at the center. Yet, I have introduced a specific focus on the learner need analysis. Now, in the past, we would have the training need analysis and the learner need analysis as two circles, and they have an intersection point. But now we actually have a far more detailed view of the LNA. And that is the core of the exercise. And then if you were to treat them as a set of concentric circles, the LNA followed by TNA, then the quantification of the learning strategy, its delivery, and then that's where the ecosystem piece fits in. All right. So the stage which is sort of happening alongside the needs analysis is the composite picture of the combination of the three metrics that we already talked about, the classic or the pieces that you already have in place, but we're going to start augmenting it with the cues for the learner performance gain, as well as the business KPIs that the business wishes to see. And now the refinement of what the business wishes to see is that crucial distinction between the ROI and the ROE I just talked about. Now, a lot of times what happens is that you have identified the gap or the training need, right? And it is understood that the learners are going to be motivated because it ticks the right boxes, but that's hardly ever the case. So the significant change that you need to bring in is to do this validation that do we have the adequate measures to motivate the learners? And once these are in place, they need to be also formally communicated to them, right? You'd be surprised that unless we get that mind share, that connects, that engagement is not going to happen. And the combination of the cues that we pick up from the LNA to the specific elements that are necessary to motivate and to show the value proposition, unless all three pieces are put together, you're not going to see the learners completely connected and engaged with the program. The learners' preferences have a clear and a direct bearing on the learning effectiveness. So the focus on these three aspects, and this is how the picture emerges, is going to be very, very vital. Now, the gauging the learner reaction, if we were to do post the program, it's a bit late in the day to do anything about it. So increasingly, our focus at AI Design, for instance, is that for significant programs between the proto and the alpha stage, we should have user group testing, or we should have a panel of target user groups as part of the entire building program, right? So now take a pick, looking at the significance of the program, but this is an important aspect which needs to be part of the foundational exercise. Now we move to the step 6 and 7, which are on the training format as well as on the strategy. Now again, remember in the toolkit I talked about that re-examine the definition of learning. So take a look at the pieces which are going to be relevant. Just because the online training met all the learning outcomes, is it readying the learner to be able to successfully apply what they have learned? Is it readying the employee to be able to make the changes in thinking or changes in behavior that were warranted? So take a look at what more needs to be augmented and supported before the right performance gain can emerge. Then we look at the learning strategy. And then, yes, there is the core of how-to part, whether it's gamification or something highly immersive like VR or your scenarios, simulations, etc. But more than that, the learning journey, which is going to help you align the learner transformation from the mode of acquiring, practice and internalizing into the long-term memory, then being able to apply in a safe zone, then be able to apply or maybe falter a bit, and then assess how do I move forward. So essentially at this juncture, when I reference the learning and performance ecosystem, is the way we build up this learning journey. So we essentially break it into the core, and core is going to help us stick what I talked about, the adequacy of content to meet the learning outcomes. But from there, we need to also extend and make sure that the forgetting curve doesn't set in. So there is room for refresh, sometimes reinforcement. There's room for bringing in variants for practice, which were not part of the primary training. Challenges which can help the learners hone their skills or move up into the next proficiency level. And then the exploration, the continuous learning, the self-directed learning. A lot of times the pure self-paced learning may not be adequate. You may want to augment it with some components of social collaborative learning, flipped classrooms, coaching sessions. Now, all of these are extremely vital in helping us achieve the goal of the performance gain, the change in thinking, behavior, upskilling, reskilling, whatever was the required mandate. Now, the gain by the learner, we typically break it into 2 stages. Now, this doesn't happen overnight. So there is a set of things that need to be put in place as part of the checkpoint exercise. Now, as we talked about the essential L&D metrics, the assessment strategy at the end of the program is always there. What you need to validate is that, is it aligning to the cognition level, which means that, is it only checking the knowledge acquisition, or is it also helping you align to the application? So a lot of times what we may do is that in the core learning journey, we have these 2 assessments. Then in the extended learning journey, we have the actual rating zones, which are going to help us see, A, the learner is now in a position to apply it into slightly different situations, which were not necessarily taught. 2, after they start applying, what is the gain that they are seeing? So there can be actually rating zones which are part of the extended learning journey, right? And then the process continues to look at now the leading indicators, right? So where we are moving it, that whether it's over a period of time. So if it's a very specific technical skill upliftment, a tool-based training, and you're upskilling them for the latest version, you're likely to see an improvement in 30 or 60 days. A leadership program, it's going to be running for a longer duration, and you would need to have more number of checkpoints before the validation process can happen. And the combination of things that we need to evaluate at this level is going to, I beg your pardon, just one moment. At this juncture is a combination of inputs that we get from the learner, the peers, the supervisor. So this is the this is another very detailed exercise that needs to be done. And we have to really structure the components of checkpointing and then the process of validation. And while I showed you the diagram, the litmus framework, and you saw it as a serial exercise, actually it is circular. So at every stage, we are collecting the cues, and typically some component of remediation or enforcement or augmentation is going to continue to happen. Right? Before I move to the impact by the business, David, is there anything that you wanted to add in terms of your own research and your insights?
Yeah, I just think it's that the idea of the way these steps are laid out is so important, especially here, looking at the idea of being able to assess what the gains for the business are. A lot of organizations tend to think that they should be able to do that once the learning's finished and start to look. But if you haven't done the previous steps, if you haven't started with that at the very beginning, what that measurement is, then when you get to this point, it's going to be almost impossible to actually make that measurement. So that has to be set out early on for sure. And then there's a quick question on these steps as you're going through. We talked about the training needs analysis early on, and Maria had a question about it. Just, does the trainer complete this for each learner that they train and over what kind of time period? But I think for you and the way you put this out, the training needs analysis is a bit larger scale than that, right?
Yeah, it is. So I'm going to touch upon this because, in the section 4, we'll talk about that, how you should poll the data. And for you to derive actionable insights, there are some basics of grouping and some aspects that I'll cover at that juncture. So that will probably give you the required insight there, Maria. Okay, so we'll touch upon this in section 4. Yeah. All right. So when we are at this crucial step of assessing the gain for the business, the key really is that what did we identify as the aspect that business wishes to see, right? While the training need identification starts with a gap or a need for a new skill that may be necessary, the process actually starts here. It doesn't end here. Now, after the proficiency was gained, what is the gain that the business should have seen, right? So I'm going to illustrate this in a moment. When I pick up the case study, then it will become very clear as to how the same thing needs to be spun for the business to be able to see that value. Now, the last stage, while I call it close the loop, because logically we've come to the step 10, but this goes back into, and it could, depending on the progress and the results, can go all the way up. So at this stage, what we are doing is that either we are ticking the aspects that we had captured from the business on the expectations that they had, or we are looking at the ROI, right? The other bit is going to be that it also gives us a pulse of that what more needs to be done now, right? And the other important aspect that it highlights is that if we are doing this intermittent checkpointing all through the journey, we don't necessarily need to look at this aggregated view, because you will start ticking some of the aspects that you had identified as part of the ROI or ROE very much in the previous stages by themselves, right? Now, I'm going to now very briefly touch upon the ROI versus the ROE. And David, I'd look forward to what are the changes that you are seeing outside of what I'm going to just highlight, what we've started seeing. So ROI, or of course the 5th level or the Phillips model add on to the Kirkpatrick model. So this essentially talks about, so remember, we are talking about the results, the 4th level, which is the impact, and then you monetize and then you divide this by the cost. Now, in contrast, the extension of the same thing, and if you were to look at it from the ROE perspective, is that we are during the needs analysis phase, talking to the business and we business leaders, and we are trying to ascertain that from a reaction perspective, what would you think would be the success factor? So out of the 100 people that the program got rolled out, if I saw 70% of the people completing it successfully within this timeline, is the expectation business has, right? That gives you a correct index. Now, from there, what is the application level gain that they would like to see? So now out of this, if I were to see this facet of the learning getting applied, which helps me accomplish this, is the expectation that I would have. So at Year Design, we are leaning now towards the return on expectations as a better index to truly illustrate the impact and the value that the training can bring in. So just wanted to check with you, David, what has been your assessment on this?
Yeah, I just think that this is really a great way to encapsulate a line of thinking that a lot of organizations are going through and maybe haven't been able to codify it the way that you have. But the idea that trying to calculate ROI specifically has been very challenging just by the nature of what it means. I think the term ROI, strikes fear into the heart of learning leaders. A lot of times, the idea of I have to justify actual dollars and cents around what I'm delivering, when the reality is a lot of the things that L&D is trying to bring to the organization are a bit more esoteric than dollars and cents. Yes, eventually they do result in that, but
Yeah.
what we're really trying to deliver on are these kinds of critical skills for the business that help the business be more effective, more resilient, more agile. A lot of these things, and they're very hard to quantify in dollars, but there are organizational outcomes and behavior outcomes that you can quantify. And then that's what I think this idea of return on expectations is, this idea of we expect that these things will be done better, faster, stronger, differently if we engage in this kind of program, and those things that you can measure. And I think it's a more palatable approach to learning other than ROI, which like I said, I think ends up stopping the conversation cold and they don't even start to go down the path.
Absolutely. So let me now pick up an example, a case study to show you that how the picture changes when you move from pure basic or the L&D metrics all the way to learner performance gain as well as the business expectation management. So I've taken a simple example of an organization which is moving away from a bunch of legacy tools to an enterprise-wide CRM tools. And obviously they needed to train the sales and marketing teams. Now, the important thing was that the mandate was that over a period of just 6 months, the tool should be ready for an org-wide rollout. So that was the part of the mandate that the L&D team got. And although in the actual project there were many more learner personas, but for simplicity, let's take a look at the 3 personas, which are the 3 sets that I've mentioned here. So in the classic need analysis phase, what would have happened is that the tool, the nature of information which is relevant for each one of these profiles would have gotten mapped. The training program would be driven by the learning outcomes that are relevant for these profiles. So as a result, what gets measured? Now here, remember, there was that time factor, which was also important. So that would have been the first thing to measure. The second bit would have been the completion rates, because this was also vital because there was a massive transition which was happening. So obviously the completion rates were important. Now these are deemed as the metrics for the quote unquote the success of the training program, right? The third bit is that definitely the mapping of the relevant content so that it meets the needs of a given learner persona was done, and hence the assessment scores are a good enough indicator that they have the required proficiency. Now, we are not wrong in any of these aspects, but do you really think that this proficiency gain is adequate for the business? Actually not. So what was really missing? The bit which was missing was that the learner performance gain is a precursor to what the business would see as the eventual gain or the value that they wanted because of this exercise. The training need was coming from some gains that the business wanted: improvement in efficiencies, higher revenues, better profitability, shorter cycles of conversion of opportunities to customers. They would have been a very wide spectrum of reasons. Now, if we view the picture from that narrow lens, what would have happened is that the focus is purely on the learning outcomes, right? So instead, what should you have done? So what it meant was that having this understanding upfront during the needs analysis phase is very critical. So remember, this was my step 2 in the litmus framework that I just talked about. Now, the program is already done. So what do we do next? So fixing this gap is feasible. What it means is that that conversation needs to happen again to clearly understand what is the return on expectation that they're talking about. So I've just taken one of the facets. So for instance, if we are talking about that one of the primary triggers for adoption of the CRM was that it brings in better efficiencies in the system, let's take a look at what can be measured. So assuming that the sales reps they were working on these multiple Excel trackers. Now, with an integrated solution, there is a time that they're able to save, assuming an hour a day. Now, this can be given for stepping up the quota of calls, right? Now, this is a tangible thing that will translate into a business gain. That is what would resonate with the business leaders. Now, the mid-level gets to see better analytics, right? Now, can this analysis drive an improvement in the conversion rates? Now, we can have benchmarks which were there in the pre-CRM situation, or we can now establish as the expected or the anticipated gain a new benchmark and see the performance against this benchmark. So remember, now I'm making it highly objective compared to a given situation. And then we can even go further by saying that if 50% of the people are able to meet the new benchmark, we deem this as a success, right? Now, the better pipeline management, can it then convert to a gain and to higher predictability in the projections, which means that there would be a more consistent outlook to the eventual targets. So now I hope I've been able to piece all of what I talked about, right? So the significance of the LNA, the significance of the aspects that are necessary to engage, motivate, but make sure that the learning proficiency go back to the definition of learning that we had talked about. And this is how the gap could be potentially offset. So we are up to the last polling question, and then the section 4 comes in.
Yep, let's go ahead and get this poll launched.
Yeah.
And it's around the ability to actually turn that data collection into actionable insights and things you can actually take action on. So it's one thing to be able to collect the data, but are we actually able to turn it into something, right? So just let us know where you think your organization is at making that that transition. I'd just like to get a sense of what's going on with the group, and I think it's worth mentioning here, David points out, Asha, that he thinks there's a challenge with ROE in that it's still sort of the same problem with a different name, in that ROI is important because that's the language that investors speak. So we need to keep working on that page. My take on that insight, David, and I appreciate that thought, is that it is true that is the language that investors speak, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the L&D team are the ones that need to be having that discussion. I think it's more about the L&D team being able to translate learning into business outcomes, and then it's up to the business leaders and stakeholders to turn those outcomes and translate those into financial impact for investors. But I think it is important that L&D is part of that conversation and understands that language and knows how to think in those terms. But trying to make the leap from a learning program straight to something that's going to be important to an investor is difficult without going through the return on expectations first. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as we're waiting for the poll to close up there, Asha.
Yeah, no, that's spot on. That's exactly why we are talking about ROE. And eventually the ROE EQs can be converted into dollars and cents by the business.
Right. So here are the results on the poll that we're looking at. And yeah, it's a challenge for sure. We got nobody who finds themselves in that excellent category, which is not surprising. And I think hopefully you can take heart in the fact that you're not alone, that most folks find themselves in these other categories.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. All right. So remember, we're just going to be looking at two facets here. So some of the best practices as you get started, and some components while you're doing the processing of the data. All right. So this is the bit which is very important. And I think, David, the answer that you just gave is very, very important, because I think once they are aware of the data, they can not only help interpret the results, but these could be then further extended to the monetary gain that the organization may be seeking, right? So I think it connects right here. The other bit is that even in the example I talked about, establishing these benchmarks on which the conclusions can be drawn, right? So like in the example that we just talked about, so there was an older benchmark which existed. The anticipated gain because of the enterprise-wide implementation of the new tool resulted in a new benchmark. And then, if then, is the situational analysis that makes more sense, right? Similarly, as an extension to that, there could be the further secondary or the tertiary indicators. So there we talked about increase in quota because of the time gain. Increase in quota then translates to more opportunities. More opportunities translate to higher number of customer acquisitions and the revenue. So that is all. So we are actually connecting the ROEs to eventually an ROI as well. So this is how it needs to build up. Now, one of the questions that I think Maria had asked was that how do you then make sense out of it? Is it on person by person, and how does it really work out? So what we normally do is that at the beginning of the exercise, you need to identify that which groupings would you need to have in place. And these are going to be then helping us guide the next actionable steps. So this is again important, and this depends on the program, nature of the program, the cognition goals, the anticipated gain. All of these need to be in place. And then it's very vital that after you sort of got this started, so you've taken cues from business, but making sure that these are discussed again with the business leaders, that we are aligned. And all this is happening alongside your training needs analysis cycle. Right now, then we come to the actual processing side. You remember the litmus in action slide that I had shown you. Now, for what we do is that for each of these levels, we identify the end goals, and much the same way as we do in the instructional design stage of the content processing. So we actually have these sub goals which aggregate to enabling, then eventually to the terminal goals. So there's a lot of data that is coming our way out there, but it needs to align to the end goals and our ability to then track the progress, right? And then we're going to be making sure that what data points are going to be collected and how exactly they would be collected. So you have combination of whether they are surveys, you have focus group discussions, there is specific interviews with some learner personas that you're going to be doing. So for instance, the first time leaders leadership program that you're launching, you would need to have all these in place for you to be able to make any sense out of this data. And inevitably, there are going to be some things which are automated from your LMS or the LXP, and some pieces which are getting collated through these additional channels that you have identified. Then we need to look at collating them. And then the crucial aspect of processing, which is a combination of filtering, sorting, then from there, prioritizing, putting them into certain groups or segments. The next bit is, I think, probably the most important one. So when we work with our customers, we are taking in this dump of the raw data and then putting it into a visual format, which then can be used for further analysis, and then looking at that analysis as the cue for what further action which is going to be necessary. Right. So I know I covered a lot of things because this section in itself is a topic for probably more than one webinar sessions. But what I was trying to tell you is that it sort of connects back to each of the steps that I walked you through in the litmus. And we can simplify, because what if, and then helps us understand that don't go for very complex questionnaires through which you are collecting the data. Look at the essential things that we need to validate, and does this cue help us move forward with the desired goal of the learner performance improvement? That in turn does it lead to the expectation definition that you had from the business, right? So try to the degree that it is feasible for you to simplify the number of inputs we're going to be working with, but this is a fairly manpower intensive effort that you need to plan for. Now, a lot of what I discussed in the session today is part of my ebook, and this is available. My team will share the link with you. This is my latest ebook. It just went live yesterday. So a quick recap of what we've talked about today. We started with the challenges and the reasons why this exercise is now a must-have. And then I walked you through some of the steps, combination of reorientation, redefinition, reimagination, which is a precursor to the exercise in itself. In section 3, I walked you through a step-by-step approach that you could potentially use to augment the efforts that you may already be doing. And more specifically, through an example, I walked you through how practically it changes that complexion from basic metrics to the kind of gain assessment that the business needs to see. And then we very, I think I touched barely the surface on the ways through which the data can be converted into insights as well as actionable steps. So if we have, I hope we have some minutes to take any questions that may be there, David.
Yeah, I think, well, we've done a pretty good job of answering the questions in real time as they came through. We do know that people were looking for the link to the ebook, but I know that is in the deck, and that if you download it, the PDF of the deck right now in your control panel, you'll have not only the deck, but those links. We'll also send out an email in the next 24 hours or so that will have a link to a recording of this webinar, as well as a place to download the PDF if you didn't grab it here today. And again, that link is in there for that ebook. And so, you know, so here's a question that came in just now from Patrick, which is great. With the growing shift towards micro-learning, how can L&D still effectively construct business relevant training, especially if it's focused on business processes, while keeping a mindset of what's in it for me for learners? I think that's a great question. It really speaks to me about how you've really hit on something here, Patrick, where in order for all these things to come together, to be able to do this kind of measurement, but also move into this next sort of evolution of what learning should be, we really have to be strong enough to blow up our previous notions of how we did things, the traditional frameworks of measurement, the traditional frameworks of how we build and deliver learning. And that's one of the things that has held companies back from making some of these changes, both from a measurement standpoint. They've been slow to make the change because their measurement frameworks don't align with this new modern learning environment, and vice versa. But I don't know, some thoughts on that, Asha?
Yeah, so I think microlearning is a great way. Remember, Patrick, we talked about the breaking the learning into the core as well as extended, right? So it allows you to do that. Also, it gives you that granularity, so that as you are doing your interim checkpointing or validation, if there are any further fixes that need to be done, whether it's a updation or sheer augmentation, it gives you room to do so, right? Now, specifically, there are sometimes a subject which may be very complex. Breaking it down into too many nuggets can make the learning very disruptive, right? So you now have a lot of micro-learning practices that can be incorporated in even a macro course, right? So I'm not sure which way your question was coming from, but I hope it addresses both perspectives that you talked about. So we leverage now nearly 60 to 70% of our projects have some components of micro-learning. And as we look at creating learning ecosystems, which are so vital in driving that performance gain, it is a must-have strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the idea of being able to figure out how, you know, the microlearning fits into your overall strategy with delivering the learning. Another insight here, Amy says they are moving to virtual learning tools in their call center, and they've been facing significant challenges in developing the key metrics to demonstrate the value that their programs bring. I'm wondering, there's a few things going on there, Amy, and I don't know if we're saying that this move to virtual learning tools is what is creating those challenges in demonstrating the value, because whatever the key metrics are, so this is where we get into it, is that the things that you are trying to achieve through your learning shouldn't change based on how that learning is delivered. Right, you're still trying to change the certain behaviors, trying to impart certain knowledge, and so the fact that you maybe have to do things more virtually doesn't change what you're after. And if you're seeing that those metrics are not being met, or is not doing as well, we then look at, okay, what are we doing in this new virtual environment that's missing the mark? How do we change that? And you can look at feedback from the learners themselves, look at various different things that are going on within the learning. But that's a key element there, and that brings to mind another question that had come up earlier, actually, Asha, was around just thoughts around training in a hybrid environment. So that's kind of related, that a lot of folks are moving to a more virtual learning environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, David, to the previous question, is that if there has been a change in the mode, right, and so suddenly you shifted to another mode, the LNA part that I talked about, very often we are not checking with the audience that what is it that they really want. In our questionnaires, for instance, we ask what they don't want to see, David, and you'll see some of the assumptions getting tested. You'd be surprised, right? The focus is on just taking the learning outcome, but the way it is delivered. And we've seen in the hybrid work environment, people have become more self-reliant, right? And they want that flexibility in the way they are learning. Right, so it wouldn't ever be the case that the change in delivery format impedes you from achieving the required goal. I think the challenge is probably taking that right feedback and making the amendments.
Yeah, this might be a challenge, but I'll give this last question as we've just crossed over the hour mark here, though. The question is, if you were to pick 3 universal metrics to measure that would show executives the value of the team's work, what would you choose?
Universal, I'm not very sure, because it's very dependent on the program. But one of the things that definitely I see all the time is the fact that business leaders want to see what happened after the training was successfully completed. What was the change that it brought in? And how did that change help the business? Right, so these 3 things they wish to see. So what the L&D teams typically are doing is that rolled out on time. This was the registration, this was the completion. 90% of the people cleared the 80% assessment score. What happened then? That is the point, correct?
Yeah.
So I think if I were to take the universal metrics would be after that, how did it get applied? How that application helped the learner? How did it help the business? So if you were to go back to the case study that I talked about, right? So completed on time, proficiencies, matching the content to that, done. But it did not translate to the expectations that the business had.
Yeah. So a very simple sort of illustration of this for me would be, if you think of the healthcare industry, and one of the training issues they have, one of the things that they're very focused on, believe it or not, is hand washing amongst healthcare professionals. And so there's all kinds of training programs about hand washing. And so let's say you put together a program, build it however you want. You have a class that's followed up by a demonstration that's followed up by micro learning, what have you, right? But the idea is, if you just simply measure that, okay, we've delivered this training on hand washing. Everybody that needs to take it has taken it. That means that everyone is properly washing their hands and now we're done with it. That's clearly not the case. As we see time and time again, it's the biggest challenge healthcare organizations face, is this hygiene issue. So the idea is, okay, deliver the training and then see, why are we asking people to do a better job with hand washing? It's because we're trying to reduce reinfection in a hospital environment, let's say. So then are we using that measurement, which clearly the hospital is already tracking, right? The infections. Has that gone up? Has that gone down? Has that not changed? So if the change is not positive, maybe the training isn't sticking. Why is that? So let's find out from the learners why that's not happening and make adjustments based on that. So again, it just shows that for almost any training program you can imagine, there has to be a business why, right? Why does this exist? Some may be, bigger and more esoteric than others, but there's always a why. And so if you can translate that why into something you can observe, something you can measure, that's how you're going to measure the effectiveness of your programs.
And just to add to that, David, is that the benchmark. See, without this training, what is it that was, say, the reinfection rate versus what was the desired and what is the actual?
Yeah.
Right? That makes it very tangible.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, we've gone a few minutes over. I think we've managed to answer all the questions. I really appreciate it. We love it when everyone's engaged and wants to ask questions. And obviously, you can follow up with Asha. She would love to give you whatever information you need and help you think through some of these things. And I do highly recommend you check out the ebook. The link is in the chat right now. If anybody would like to go ahead and click on that link, and you can get it right then and there. But Asha, as always, thank you so much for your time and all your work and your insights and your willingness to share all of this with everyone.
Thank you so much. As always, it was a wonderful session. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone.